Matthew Grace spent 22 years behind bars for the murder of his wife Eleanor. Until one afternoon, 5 years after his release, he saw her alive, smiling, and pushing a stroller with her new family. In the summer of 1998, the peaceful town of Willow Creek, Oregon, was thrown into turmoil by the sudden disappearance of Eleanor Grace. A well-known face in the neighborhood, Eleanor was admired for her work as a local librarian and for her seemingly perfect marriage to Matthew Grace, a hard-working construction foreman. The couple had been together since college and were widely seen as the embodiment of stability and devotion. But beneath the surface, there were quiet tensions building that only a few people noticed. Occasional arguments, unexplained absences, and the distant, blank look that sometimes crept across Eleanor's face when she thought no one was watching. And on a warm July morning, Eleanor failed to show up for work. Her co-workers were concerned. It was unlike her to miss a day without calling in. Several calls to her home went unanswered. A neighbor who regularly walked her dog past the Grace's modest house recalled seeing Eleanor watering her plants the evening before, smiling politely but seeming distracted. By the afternoon of the second day, with no contact, her sister reported her missing. When police arrived at the Grace home, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, nothing appeared stolen or broken, but something felt wrong. A half-prepared breakfast sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Eleanor's purse and keys were still on the table. Her car was in the driveway. What immediately drew investigators' attention was a large, faint bloodstain on the beige carpet near the kitchen door, partially cleaned but not hidden well enough. It looked like someone had tried to wipe it up in a hurry. That stain became the turning point. Detectives focused on Matthew immediately. He had reported to work early the day she vanished and claimed he hadn't seen her that morning, but under pressure his timeline wavered. He said Eleanor had been in a strange mood the night before, that she had mentioned needing space, but no one else recalled her speaking of any plans to leave. Police learned that the couple had recently argued over finances and that Eleanor had withdrawn a large amount of money just a week before disappearing. Matthew insisted he didn't know anything about it. A few days later, her car was found abandoned near the edge of the Crescent Pines Forest Reserve, about 30 miles from their home. The driver's seat was pushed far forward, unusual for Eleanor, who was tall. Inside the glove compartment, officers discovered her wedding ring, carefully placed in a small pouch, along with her cell phone and a photograph of her as a child. The positioning of these items gave the illusion of closure, almost like a goodbye, but there was still no sign of her body. Search teams combed the forest for over a week with dogs, helicopters, and volunteers, but they found nothing. Rumors started spreading fast. Some claimed Matthew had snapped in a moment of rage. Others believed Eleanor had staged her own vanishing act. Her sister insisted she would never abandon her family without a word, but as weeks turned to months, and months turned into a year, the focus stayed squarely on Matthew. He had no alibi for the critical hours. He failed a polygraph test. He had scratches on his arms that he said came from a work site. Prosecutors built their case around circumstantial evidence and motive, pointing to Eleanor's money withdrawal, the blood stain, and what they called his odd behavior. The trial was swift and tense. There was no body, no murder weapon, and no direct eyewitness. But the prosecution painted a chilling portrait of a husband driven to violence by resentment and control. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, the courtroom erupted. Matthew sat in silence, his face blank. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of his wife, despite maintaining his innocence at every stage. Eleanor Grace was officially declared dead. A memorial was held, attended by friends and family who grieved over an empty casket. Her photo, smiling and radiant, was placed at the front of the church. No one knew then that this was only the beginning of one of the most bizarre and haunting true crime stories in the town's history. Prison became a world of its own for Matthew Grace, After the judge handed down the 30-year sentence, he was transferred to a medium-section facility hundreds of miles from Willow Creek. The day he was taken away, he didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even look back. He simply lowered his head and walked forward into a future he didn't choose. From the outside, many believed justice had been served. To the public, he was the man who killed his beautiful wife, disposed of her body, and then played the part of a confused, grieving husband. But to Matthew, every passing day was a living nightmare, one long sentence built on silence, grief, and a truth he couldn't convince anyone to believe. The first few years behind bars were a blur of routines and isolation. He spent most of his time in the prison library or working in the laundry room. He never got into fights, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and avoided forming close bonds. The other inmates called him the Widowmaker, half mocking, half respectful. He never responded to the nickname. Prison guards said he was one of the quietest inmates they'd ever encountered. Still, silence did not protect him from the crushing loneliness. Back home, life had moved on without him. Eleanor's family had disowned him publicly. His home was repossessed, his belongings auctioned off. The few friends who once stood by him eventually stopped writing. His parents visited a few times in the beginning, always hopeful that new evidence would emerge, that someone would come forward. But hope faded. His mother passed away quietly in 2008 after a long illness. His father, heartbroken, followed 2 years later. Only his younger sister Michelle remained in his corner. She visited every month, always with a folder in hand, court records, case updates, her own notes. She refused to let the system forget her brother. Michelle worked tirelessly, even quitting her job as a school counselor to focus full-time on advocating for Matthew's release. She sent letters to Innocence Projects, requested DNA testing, and tried to file appeals, all to no avail. The justice system had closed the chapter on Eleanor Grace long ago, and no one wanted to revisit it. With no new evidence and no body, reopening the case was nearly impossible. Matthew grew more resigned with each passing year, spending his time journaling, reading, and replaying the final days of his marriage in his mind, searching for anything he had missed. He was tormented not only by the loss of freedom, but by the lingering question, what if Eleanor had left by choice? He wasn't allowed to say that during the trial. His defense team advised him it would sound like desperation. The court wouldn't entertain theories without proof. But deep down there had always been a sliver of doubt in Matthew's mind, not about his innocence, but about the version of Eleanor everyone else believed in. She had changed in those final months. She was more distant, more private. She began locking her desk drawers, spending more time out of the house, and she had started to journal, something she'd never done before. Once, he'd opened one of her notebooks and found a single sentence scribbled repeatedly across the page. I need a new life. Still, when she vanished, the idea that she could have orchestrated it all seemed too far-fetched, until prison gave him nothing but time to think. Over the years, his certainty that she had died gave way to something else, a gnawing suspicion that he had been framed, not by someone else, but by the person he had loved the most. After 22 years, he was quietly granted early release for good behavior. He didn't celebrate. There was no joy, no crowd, no sign of closure. He left the prison gates with nothing but a small duffel bag, a few personal belongings, and his sister waiting in the parking lot. He was 56 years old. The world had changed. Cell phones, cars, even street names looked different. He returned not to Willow Creek, but to a new town under a new name, hoping to rebuild a life from the ruins. He started working as a landscaper for a small company and rented a room above a retired couple's garage. He kept to himself, rarely talked about his past, and did everything he could to disappear into the background. But fate had other plans. Because just 5 years after his release, on an ordinary weekday in an ordinary park, Matthew's past came walking right back into his life. Alive, breathing, and holding the hand of a child. It happened on a Wednesday, just after noon, the kind of quiet afternoon that came and went without notice. Matthew was making a routine mulch delivery to Maplewood Park, a well-kept area known for its clean playgrounds, shaded benches, and winding walking trails. He had done this job dozens of times before. Nothing ever stood out. But as he turned the corner of the maintenance road, pushing the wheelbarrow toward the flower beds near the playground, his world stopped. Across the park, beneath a tree near the swings, a woman was crouched beside a stroller, adjusting the sunshade. Her hair was darker now, shorter and curled into soft waves. She wore sunglasses and a light blue sweater. Her posture was relaxed, and she smiled warmly at a toddler who bounced with excitement beside her. A man approached, likely her husband, who gently placed his hand on her back and kissed her cheek. Matthew dropped the wheelbarrow. It hit the ground with a dull thud, but he barely heard it. Every muscle in his body froze. His heart pounded against his chest like a warning drum. It wasn't possible. But it was her. It was Eleanor, or someone who looked exactly like her. Not just similar, identical in a way that defied coincidence. The same cheekbones, the same subtle tilt of her head when she laughed, the same small birthmark on her neck, barely visible just above her collar. He stood there in disbelief, blinking, half expecting the image to vanish. But she didn't vanish. She moved, she spoke, she picked up the child and handed a bottle to the man beside her. Then she walked toward the far gate, her figure drifting further away with each step, completely unaware that the man she had left behind over 2 decades ago was watching her from the shadows. For hours afterward, Matthew sat in his truck outside the park, replaying what he'd seen. He questioned everything. Was it really her? Could it be a mistake? A look-alike? A cruel twist of fate? But no. He had stared into her face. There was no doubt. She hadn't aged much, perhaps a benefit of a different lifestyle, a different name, a different story. But it was her, alive, living openly, with a new family. That night he couldn't sleep. His thoughts spun in 1,000 directions. The grief, the rage, the disbelief, none of it had prepared him for this moment. He had spent 22 years locked away for a crime that had never occurred. He had buried her memory, been haunted by the mystery of what had happened to her, and now she was not only alive, but had built an entirely new life as if he never existed. The next day he returned to the park. He sat on a bench, pretending to read a newspaper, watching from a distance. She arrived again, same stroller, same routine. This time, he followed her discreetly as she walked home. It wasn't far, a neat 2-story house on a quiet street. Wind chimes on the porch, children's bikes leaned against the wall. The mailbox read, Hartwell. Not Grace, not even close. He followed her for the next week, staying at a safe distance. She went to work each morning at a small local clinic, where she appeared to be a nurse or administrative assistant. She greeted coworkers by name. She shopped at the neighborhood grocery store. She volunteered at her children's school. Every action, every smile, every gesture was so ordinary, so carefully normal. She had seamlessly integrated into this new world, leaving behind everything and everyone from her past. Matthew couldn't make sense of it. How had she done it? How had she disappeared without a trace, evaded the law, created a whole new identity? And more importantly, why? Why had she let him suffer? Why had she allowed a courtroom full of people to believe he killed her? One thing was clear: she had never meant to be found. She had erased herself with precision. But now, the secret she had buried for 27 years was unraveling. And Matthew, the man she'd left behind in a prison cell, had just found the key to everything. Matthew knew he couldn't go to the police with nothing but a gut feeling and a memory burned into his soul. He needed proof. real, undeniable, and legal. So he contacted a private investigator named Tony Calver, a retired state trooper who now worked out of a modest office above a pawn shop. Tony didn't ask many questions at first. He just listened, took notes, and agreed to quietly look into the woman known as Elena Hartwell. Within days, Tony confirmed the first strange fact. Elena Hartwell didn't exist before the year 2000. There was no birth certificate, no high school records, no social security number predating that year. It was as if she had been born at the age of 31, just 2 years after Eleanor Grace had disappeared from Willow Creek. Her entire life prior to that year was blank. Tony began tracing her documents: marriage license, driver's license, employment history. All of it was clean, neat, and clearly constructed. Too clean. Too neat. The first breakthrough came when Tony dug into DMV records and discovered that Eleanor's photo, slightly altered but unmistakably the same person, had been used for Elena's first driver's license. The facial recognition flagged it immediately, something that hadn't been available back in 2000. From there, everything began. Using public records and discreet surveillance, Tony built a timeline. Elena had moved to her current town in 2002, changed her hair, altered her voice slightly, and begun working at a medical clinic under a fabricated past. She told people she had grown up in Kansas, claimed she had been previously married to a man who died in a car crash, and never spoke of extended family. No one questioned it. She was well-liked, good with children, and seemed utterly ordinary. She had 2 children with her current husband, a local contractor named Daniel Hartwell, who appeared to have no idea who his wife really was. Then came the most chilling discovery. Tony managed to retrieve hotel records from July 1998, just days after Eleanor had vanished. A woman using the alias Ella Martin had checked into a motel 3 hours from Willow Creek. The ID used was never recovered, but the guest had paid in cash and stayed 3 nights. The handwriting on the sign-in sheet matched Eleanor's known writing from high school records and old letters. From there, a pattern emerged. She moved from place to place for 2 years, never staying long, until finally settling and beginning a new life as Elena. The motive remained murky, but as Tony traced further back, he unearthed Eleanor's private bank account that no one had known about, not even Matthew. She had been quietly saving money for over a year before her disappearance. Small amounts at first, then larger withdrawals in the final months. Over $27,000, 0 cents, had been withdrawn in total just before she vanished. It became clear this had been a long-planned escape, not a spur-of-the-moment decision. She had wanted out, and she had done everything to make sure she was never found. What stood out the most, though, wasn't what she had done to vanish. It was what she hadn't done afterward. She never came forward during Matthew's arrest, never intervened during his trial, never sent an anonymous tip or planted a clue. She had watched from the shadows, fully aware that the man she had once called her husband was being blamed for her murder, and she had allowed it to happen. The weight of that truth hit Matthew like a second sentence. Not just that she had left, but that she had sacrificed his life for her freedom. It wasn't self-preservation, it was calculated silence. She didn't just walk away from him, she buried him. With the evidence gathered, Matthew finally had something solid. He had photos, timelines, facial recognition reports, handwriting comparisons, and witness confirmations. It was time to take the findings to the authorities and force the truth into the light. But a part of him hesitated, because exposing her meant more than just vindication. It meant upending the lives of 2 innocent children. It meant telling her husband he had been living beside a ghost. And it meant coming face to face with the woman who had destroyed him, not with violence, but with the coldest betrayal imaginable. Matthew sat in his truck outside the police department for nearly an hour before finally stepping inside. The evidence in his hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. It wasn't just paper. It was the truth, and it burned. He expected skepticism, dismissal, maybe even a demand to leave. But the detective on duty that day wasn't part of the original case. He was younger, more curious than combative, and when he saw the folder and the name Eleanor Grace, his eyes narrowed with interest. It took weeks for the district attorney's office to process everything. They reopened the case quietly, behind closed doors, under the pretext of reviewing potential wrongful conviction claims. Matthew was interviewed repeatedly, so was his sister. Tony Calver handed over every file, photograph, and timeline he had built. Investigators confirmed the alias, the forged documents, and the travel history. The facial recognition match was undeniable. The handwriting comparison results came back positive. And finally, they located one of Eleanor's distant cousins who had recognized her in the new photos, even before being told what the case involved. When authorities arrived at the Hartwell residence with a sealed warrant, Eleanor, now Elena, was in the backyard planting flowers. She didn't resist. She didn't ask why. In fact, she didn't say a word as they placed her in handcuffs and led her into the car. Her husband stood frozen in the doorway, holding their toddler, completely unable to understand what was happening. Back at the station, under quiet but firm questioning, Eleanor admitted what she had done. She said she had felt trapped in her life, emotionally suffocated, unable to see a way out. She said Matthew had become cold, controlling, and she feared that someday, if she stayed, things would turn violent. There were no police reports to support her claim, no journal entries offered as evidence, nothing but her words, spoken softly in a room without cameras. She explained that she had staged her disappearance by creating a false scene, intentionally spilling her own blood during a minor injury in the kitchen and leaving behind items that would make it look like she had been abducted or killed. She said she believed Matthew would be suspected, but she never expected he would be convicted. Once he was arrested, she felt there was no going back. Revealing the truth then, she claimed, would have destroyed everything she had planned for. Her statements triggered a media storm. Within hours of her unmasking, national headlines screamed with disbelief. "Wife faked death, husband served 22 years," dominated news cycles. Television shows, podcasts, and columnists jumped on the story. The once quiet case of Eleanor Grace became a national obsession. Everyone had an opinion. Was she a victim or a manipulator? Was Matthew a man misunderstood, or just lucky to be free? The legal system, bound by time, couldn't charge Eleanor with her own murder. The statute of limitations had passed on most of the forgery and fraud involved in her escape. She was indicted on perjury and obstruction charges, but even those carried minimal penalties. What shocked the public most was that she would never truly pay for what she had done to Matthew. No jail sentence could restore the 22 years he had lost. No apology could erase the decades of loneliness, suspicion, and shame he had endured. Matthew filed a civil suit against the state for wrongful conviction and was awarded $12,400,000, 0 cents. He used none of it for personal luxuries. Most of it went toward legal reform programs and innocence projects. He became a quiet figure in the background of national discussions on justice. Not a celebrity, not a spokesperson, just a man who had been forgotten, until the lie unraveled. He never spoke to Eleanor again. He never confronted her in court. He didn't attend her hearings. The last time he saw her was from the back of a courtroom, where she sat with her eyes low, her wedding ring removed. She looked older, tired, but not remorseful. Just empty. Years later, he bought a small cabin by a lake and lived alone. People left him alone. He took long walks in the woods and read books by the fireplace. There were no photos of Eleanor in the house, no reminders of the past. Only silence and a name etched into the wooden frame above his door. Truth does not die, even when people do.